Welcome to lecture 5 of the course Philosophy of Science for Psychologists. This lecture is about the critical rationalist Karl Popper. In the last lecture we have seen that with the rise of logical positivism we actually got from epistemology to philosophy of science. We started by thinking about the source of knowledge. Where does knowledge come from? If it's possible, the skeptic argues that knowledge is impossible. The rationalist says if you use your reason properly, you will gain knowledge. The empiricist will say if you observe the world, then you have all these experiences. That's the source of knowledge. We have seen there is a Kantian synthesis of rationalism and empiricism that says, well, if you use both your reason and your senses, that will be the source of knowledge. And we have seen that all of these attempts to justify our knowledge failed. But science is still a highly successful method to, well, gain knowledge, at least gain beliefs, that if you use them to make predictions about the world, those predictions are successful. So what the logical positivists did was say, well, if you want to gain knowledge, you have to use a method. Clearly, science is the best method. So that in some sense answers the question, what's the source of knowledge? Where does knowledge come from? Well, we use science. But then, of course, the question is, what is science? What distinguishes science from pseudoscience? What is so specific about this method that other methods do not have? Properties that the scientific method has, that reading palms or something like, staring at the stars to gain knowledge about personality and the future, does not have. We have seen that the logical positivist came up with two demarcation criteria. Verifiability, that's the first demarcation criterion. That's much too strong, because if you want to have general claims in science, no general claim can be verified, can ever be verified, so they are unverifiable, they're all unscientific. So any discipline that uses general claims, basically that's every scientific discipline, according to that demarcation criterion, will be unscientific. So you have to have a weaker demarcation criterion. And then they proposed confirmability in combination with a little confirmation. But, well, then the question is, what is enough confirmation? Is one instance of an individual that falls under your hypothetical general law, is that enough to justify the general law? Well, that's a big problem. It doesn't seem to work, and anything becomes science. So in both cases, you could say it failed as a demarcation criterion. If you first say verifiability, make sure basically that there is no science. It's so strong a criterion that nothing satisfies it, and thus there is no science. So this set of disciplines that are scientific is empty, and with confirmability, the set of those disciplines that are scientific is filled with all the disciplines, and the set of disciplines that are not scientific is empty. So it doesn't make a distinction between two things. A demarcation criterion has to make a distinction between two things, in this case, between science and pseudoscience, and a set of scientific disciplines and a set of pseudoscientific disciplines or non-scientific disciplines, they both need to have some elements in them. Let us start by making one thing really clear, and it is that Karl Popper is not a logical positivist. Let's look at two quotes, one of Karl Popper and one of the logical positivists. Popper writes, everybody knows nowadays that logical positivism is dead, but nobody suspects that there may be a question to be asked here. The question, who's responsible, or rather, who's done it? I fear that I must admit responsibility. Well, Popper is not very modest here. It seems that he has the opinion that he single-handedly killed logical positivism, but of course the logical positivists were smart enough to understand that their project had failed, especially when it came to finding a demarcation criterion. But just to make sure that Karl Popper is not a logical positivist, he himself says logical positivism is dead. He is not a logical positivist. And people are inclined to think that he is. So that is something I also see on the exams. Sometimes that goes wrong because Popper, as we will see, is interested in some of the same topics the logical positivists were interested in. And he also has some views that are similar. If you think about the question where knowledge comes from, he also answers from science, for instance. So naturally, one is inclined to adduce Sir Karl Popper's work. So naturally, we are inclined to think that Karl Popper is also a logical positivist. This is something Karl Hempel writes, and Hempel was a logical positivist, as we saw last lecture. But Popper carried on an intensive and fruitful exchange of ideas with various logical positivists. They were even friends. He has consistently represented himself as an outside critic of the movement, and he cannot therefore be reckoned among its proponents. So also Hempel, one of the leading logical positivists, says, Popper, we had debates with him, some were even friends with him, but they are different with respect to the views they defend. Logical positivists, we saw last lecture, were empiricists, and Karl Popper, we will see, is a rationalist. We'll start by briefly looking at two questions Popper asks and his answers, and then we'll go and look at some relevant biographical data from his childhood to see that he was already at an early age thinking about the distinction between science and pseudoscience and why he was thinking about that. And then we'll have already enough information to see that Popper and the logical positivists differ a little bit and have also something in common. And then we'll look at, and that's the main part of this course, this lecture, we look at Popper's views. His views, called critical rationalism, he defends a falsificationism, so it has 4 characteristics that are really important, and we'll discuss them. Falsifiability as a demarcation criterion. He is a rationalist, so we have to look at his views on innate ideas, because that's the associated claim rationalists make. The claim that nativism is true, that in some way knowledge is inborn, is innate. And he is a critical rationalist, so we have to look at the critical part of his rationalism and, of course, at why it is a rationalism. We also will evaluate the view he defends in section 5, and we'll end with a conclusion, a preview, and of course a test question. Let's look at 2 questions Popper asks. The first question is whether or not we can save science from the use of induction. We saw in earlier lectures that it looks like you need induction to come up with general claims. If you say, and let's use the example again, I know it's a bit boring, but these are the examples these great philosophers use. Let's use the example again. All swans are white. How do you know? How did we get at this general claim? Or all human beings are mortal. How do we get at this? Well, we have seen some swans, but not all, and they were white. And then we use induction, generalization, and we infer, based on the available evidence, that all swans are white, or similarly, we infer, based on seeing some people die, that all human beings are mortal. So it looks like we cannot do without induction. But induction, we know, is an invalid way of reasoning. So if science uses induction, if we use induction, that is a bit irrational, you could say. So is there a way to escape induction, to escape the irrationality of induction? So that's the first question. And the second one, of course, is, okay, if we are in agreement that science is the source of knowledge, so we have answered the epistemological question, where does knowledge come from, with the answer from science, then the next question is, what is science? How do you distinguish science from everything else? So you need a demarcation criterion, and the question, of course, then is, can the critical rationalist, can Karl Popper come up with a better demarcation criterion than verifiability and confirmability, the two demarcation criteria of the logical positivist? And in both cases, Popper answers yes. Yes, we can do science without induction, and yes, we can find a demarcation criterion that does make a distinction between science and pseudoscience. So let's look at that and let's evaluate that. If we look at the life of the young Karl Popper, we already see that he was thinking at an early age about science. Popper was born in Vienna, just like Wittgenstein and some of the logical positivists, and he went to high school there, and in 1917 he leaves high school. Basically, he writes in his autobiography that his teachers couldn't learn him anything more, so he, again, not quite the modest person, but they couldn't teach him anymore, and he went to university. He didn't finish high school, he just went to university. That was possible back then in Vienna. The fees were really low, and you could study anything you wanted. So he does that, he goes to study at the university, and then he briefly joins the Marxist movement as basically a young kid. And then he walks in a demonstration, a Marxist demonstration, and that demonstration goes horribly wrong. That is, there's a clash between the protesters and the police. The police shoots at the people protesting, and they actually kill some of them. And then Popper writes that he was horrified and shocked at the police, but also at himself, because, well, he says, I'm a Marxist, I was part of the demonstration, the protest, and I bore part of the responsibility for the tragedy, at least in principle, because, well, Marxist theory demands that the class struggle be intensified in order to speed up the coming of socialism. So the revolution will come anyway, so we have to intensify this class struggle, and the revolution may claim some victims, it will claim less victims than if we kept on doing things the capitalist way. That is the Marxist theory, or that was the Marxist theory, and it was part of so-called scientific socialism. And that's when he starts wondering about science. I now ask myself, he writes, whether such a calculation could ever be supported by science. is Marxism really science? And then, of course, you'll stumble upon that question in real life, what science is. So he's at a very young age thinking about the difference between science and pseudoscience. And it is, for him, it is a practical question, you could almost say. It is something that has relevance for practical life, for his practical life. Is Marxism science? Popper leaves the Marxist movement, as you can imagine. What did he at least learn from this brief joining of the Marxists and this clash with the police? Well, he learns that human beings are fallible. We make mistakes. You make mistakes yourself, but even great thinkers like Karl Marx did. There's no doubt that Karl Marx was a great thinker, an intelligent human being who thought about how to best make a society. A lot of people followed him, and they were all wrong. So Popper says there's a difference between dogmatism and thinking critically. So saying, oh yes, the great thinker Karl Marx said this, he's right. It's a dogma. It is something we all believe as Marxists. So dogmatism is something different from thinking critically, thinking for yourself, thinking basically what we're trying to give you all kinds of tools for in this course and at the courses at university in general. We want to give you the skills, the knowledge to think about whether psychology is a science or not. And clearly, I have my views on that, but in the end, it's you who has to come up with an argued for view on whether psychology is or is not a science. You're the psychologist. If you think it's science, you can use it, for instance, to try and help people if you want to become a clinical psychologist. Or you can use the scientific research method to find out more about the human psyche or the animal psyche. But if you, in the end, have to say, well, I do believe that psychology is a pseudoscience, then you might write books against it and go out on the street and say no more psychology at universities. Either way, it's you who has to come up with an answer to the question, is psychology a science? So there's a difference between dogmatism, believing what the teacher says, because, well, he's the teacher, he's the expert, and thinking for yourself. In the end, it doesn't matter what my views are. It's all about your views, and we are here to facilitate you in thinking critically. And Popper learns that at a young age, that you shouldn't think dogmatically. Now, we'll see in more detail how this works out in his philosophy of science when he gets older. And then we'll also see how we can explain, or at least how Popper explains, that we have this tendency to be dogmatic thinkers. So it's really hard to think critically. At the beginning of this lecture, we saw that some people are inclined to think that Popper was a logical positivist. Let's compare some elements from both philosophies of science to see that he wasn't, but that it's understandable that people made this mistake. Prior to actually explaining Popper's view, we can already make some things clear, some things that they are in agreement about. So the logical positivists were empiricists. That means that they adhere to some empiricist principle that you say, well, where does knowledge come from? Well, it comes from science, but they interpret science as empiricist. That is, you use your senses, you have all kinds of experiences, and that's the source of knowledge. That's how you justify claims. Popper was not a logical positivist, but what we have seen basically already in history, when we're talking about rationalists, then you'll see that Plato was the most extreme rationalist, and that already in the 17th century, René Descartes was much less radical. Today we'll see that Popper, again, is even less radical than Descartes was. So you'll see that rationalism tends to move towards empiricism, but it never becomes empiricism. But Popper also will say, of course, well, of course experience is important if you gain knowledge. And you already see that in Descartes. Descartes says, well, how do I get the idea of the sun? Well, I look at it, and then I see that it's about this big, and then you use your ratio to basically check the concept you acquired via your senses. So Popper also can accept experience as something that's important to gain knowledge, but he thought that the logical positivists were too radical. And of course, being empiricist, the moment you are less radical, you actually become partially a rationalist, while the rationalist, when he becomes less radical, remains a rationalist, because you say so what Descartes would say, all my concepts have to be checked by my ratio, and that makes me a rationalist. Okay, so that's one thing, and another thing that we're not going to debate, but I'll just mention it here. So you'll see that there is this agreement where you might not expect it. Popper also agreed that logic and mathematics are just tools and do not provide us with knowledge. So he does disagree with Kant, who says there is synthetic a priori knowledge in logic and mathematics. The logical positivist also says, well, logic basically isn't about the world, it's about structure of your theories. Same goes for Popper. There is, however, a big disagreement, and that has to do with this problem of induction. So the difference is about the model of science. So let's look at the logical positivist model. They say, well, you observe things. You observe a couple of swans and they're all white, and you observe a couple of human beings and they're all mortal, and then via induction you get to general laws. You'll get to all swans are white and all human beings are mortal. And then you use this general claim to deduce what the next swan will be, what the next human being will be. You make predictions. You predict that the next swan will be white and the next human being will be mortal. So you have used induction in the context of discovery of the general law, and now you'll find, well, confirmation for this law when the next swan is white or the next human being indeed is mortal, and then you say, aha, see, you were right. That's the context of justification. Then you justify your general claim by finding more evidence for it. But then you'll just have one swan more and one human being more, of which you can say, well, all swans, that supports the claim, all swans are white or all human beings are mortal. And that means you still use induction. So induction is central to the model of science of the logical positive, even though they say, well, what unifies all sciences is, at least at the methodological level, is that they all use the deductive nomological model. You also need to use induction. At least that's one way. We have seen that they tried to come up with a different way that you can say, well, you're allowed any method, but then it has to stand up to testing. And that's more in line with what Popper says. So some logical positivists were already going into the direction Popper later went. So first there is a problem. So it's not the observation of 10 swans or 100 swans that were white or 10 or 100 humans that were mortal. You'll see something and then a problem comes up in your head. You'll see an apple falling, such as the famous example of Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton sees an apple falling from a tree and thinks, why does the apple fall from the tree? Then you postulate some hypothesis, a conjecture. So you come up with something out of the blue, I don't know, doesn't really matter where it comes from, and then you try to refute this conjecture. Then you try to falsify it. And this, I think, is really different from the logical positivist. The logical positivists try to find support. They're looking for empirical evidence, either in verifiability or confirmability. What you see is that they say, well, if that's the hallmark of science, finding evidence, whether you try to verify or confirm a claim, you'll try to find support. And Popper says, no. A proper scientist, and that's what we need to explain why he says this, tries to refute their conjectures, their hypotheses. That is really counterintuitive. And that also has to do with Popper's explanation of why we are dogmatic thinkers. So let's take a look at his critical rationalism. Let's now look in more detail to the philosophy of science of Karl Popper. He defended a critical rationalism. Today we'll look at 4 elements of Popper's philosophy of science. The first one is that we make mistakes. Human beings are fallible. Hence, all our claims will be falsifiable. At least all scientific claims are falsifiable. So falsifiability is the demarcation criterion, according to Popper. He is a rationalist, and in the very first lecture we saw that rationalists defend nativism, the idea that some of our knowledge is inborn. Popper, in some sense, also defends nativism, clearly not in the sense that Plato did, and also clearly, or at least that will become apparent, not in the sense that Descartes did, but he did defend some kind of nativism. If we look at that, we'll also immediately see what his ideas on induction were. After that, we'll take a look at why his critical rationalism is critical and why indeed it is a rationalism. And after that, of course, we will evaluate his views. So let's start with falsificationism. You could say Popper defends falsificationism, in which falsifiability is the demarcation criterion. To explain this, Popper says, well, let's look at examples of scientists and of pseudoscientists. He says Marx and Freud were examples of pseudoscientists. The way he frames it, you might say that the Marxists were pseudoscientists, but he says Marx and Freud are examples of pseudoscientists, and Newton and Einstein are examples of proper scientists. So what is this difference, this distinction between science and non-science? He discusses one thing, and that's important enough to think about it for a moment. He says, it's true to the demarcation criteria, and it's not such a strange suggestion, because if science is the method to gain knowledge, and knowledge is a justified and true belief, then truth might indeed be the demarcation criterion to distinguish science from pseudoscience, truth might be the hallmark of science. And then Popper says, no, scientific theory does not have to be true. And then he gives all kinds of examples. Take, for instance, all astronomical theories. They were false, so they're not true, but they were not unscientific. So take the view that the Earth is in the center of the universe. That's not necessarily unscientific. You can have a scientific theory based on the available empirical evidence back then, and you say, well, my conclusion is that Earth is in the center of the universe. Or with Copernicus, there we see this turn in science where we say we went from the geocentric theory about the universe to the heliocentric theory about the universe. We said we did no longer put the Earth in the center of the universe, but the Sun. That was a change in the science of thinking about the universe. There was a change in astronomy. Still, it was wrong. The Sun is not in the center of the universe. So it's false, but it is scientific. The fact that it can be false, it might be false, that, according to Popper, is the demarcation criterion. Falsifiability, the possibility that it's false, the possibility that it could be refuted, that is the hallmark of science. So it's not truth. The thing can be true without being, so we'll see that in a moment. Things can also be true without being scientific, and things can be scientific without being true. But you aim for truth, right? Science is the method that provides us with knowledge, and knowledge is a justified and true belief. So the aim of science is to provide us with justified and true beliefs. So truth is the aim. So that means that as a scientist you shouldn't lie. But not lying is not the same as telling the truth. Because you might genuinely think you're telling the truth, so you're not lying, but you might still not be telling the truth. So, and that is because we are fallible. Human beings make mistakes. So let's look at that in more detail. Look at falsifiability as the demarcation criterion. Let's give you a good reason to believe that falsifiable theories are scientific theories, or at least that scientific theories have to be falsifiable. And that is that falsifiable theories, and only falsifiable theories, are informative. I hope that I can convince you of that, so that you see that there indeed is something to Popper's idea, because we'll see it's very counterintuitive. It goes against our nature. And Popper also explains what our nature is. Our nature is dogmatic thinking, inductive reasoning. That is how we think about the world. But where the logical positivists try to find indeed evidence for our inductively generated general claims, Popper tries to falsify them. So as a proper scientist tries to falsify their theories. And then, at the moment you actually have a falsification, only then you gain knowledge. And that also is very counterintuitive. So, I think there's a lot to be said in favor of Popper's view. So let's look at that, evaluate it at the end of this lecture, because you might have guessed that there are some problems with it, but there is something really good about his theory. We can learn a lot of it. So human beings are fallible. Popper says, I had this run-in with the police as a Marxist, which made me doubt Marxism, and he left the Marxist movement. But Marxism claimed to be scientific. So he says, what's this distinction between science and pseudoscience? Because I want knowledge, and apparently even great thinkers like Marx are fallible. They make mistakes. I make mistakes, but I might not be the great thinker that Marx was. But even Marx, even Aristotle made mistakes. Even Newton was wrong. Newton's theories were replaced by those of Einstein. And then Popper says that's a conclusion, and we'll see how that works out. But he basically claims that we cannot know, we can only guess. You can never know that all swans are white. You can never know that all human beings are mortal. So you can never be sure, 100% sure about your theories. And that is because we're fallible, we make mistakes. It has also a social consequence. So this is a little side remark, but I hope you see how important it is when you think about science that this actually has relevance for society. So if we can never be sure about anything, then nobody knows what a just society looks like. So people writing books like Marx, like Plato wrote an entire book about the Republic, how a just society, according to him, looks like, and it's not a democracy. It is, well, it has some democratic elements, but in the end, the philosopher has to be the ruler, the king. I think that's a very bad idea. But Marx had his ideas of how the perfect society, a just society, looked like, a Mao, and we've seen the problems with that. I don't say people might not have good intentions. I think Marx did have good intentions, but it didn't work out that well. And then Popper says, well, we shouldn't try to make a society just, in the sense that we come up with a plan what a just society looks like and try to install that, but we should eradicate injustice. We could rid of the injustice in society, and in science we get rid of the false hypothesis instead of finding out what the true hypotheses are. So there is this, you can compare both endeavors. So Popper, if you're interested, he wrote also about society and politics. And basically, this is in a nutshell what the bottom line is. Back to his philosophy of science. Human beings are fallible creatures. We make mistakes. That means that scientists make mistakes. And as long as it's an honest mistake, there's no problem. Don't lie, but also don't expect scientists to always only tell the truth. You might expect from scientists that they always only think that they're telling the truth. You should, as a scientist, only tell things which you believe that they are true. Let's take a look at another mini theory and then see that some things can be true without being scientific. Tomorrow it will rain or not. Also, classic example, tomorrow it will rain. That's a falsifiable claim. That can be wrong. So if you now know, oh, but I'm a fallible being. So if you're a weatherman and you have a scientific method of finding out, predicting tomorrow's weather, and you say, well, my scientific method tells me that tomorrow it is going to rain, but well, I've been wrong before, human beings have been wrong before, so I don't want to make a claim that is possibly false. I want to be absolutely sure. Then you can do it like this. You just add or not. Tomorrow it will rain or not. And then you're making a true prediction, because there is no weather type that doesn't support this. So if it actually rains, you say, see, it's true. And if it doesn't, you say, well, see, it's true. It will rain or not. It's not raining. See, I was right. So this is true, but not scientific. The reason being that it's not informative, and we'll get back to that. And we already saw that astronomical theories, like that of Ptolemy, putting the Earth in the center of the universe, and Copernicus, putting the sun in the center of the universe, they were scientific, but they were false. So truth is not a proper demarcation criterion. Verifiability, confirmability, we looked at that in last lecture. Those suggestions for demarcation criteria also failed. So that doesn't work. And now Popper is looking at falsifiability. And what he says is, well, tomorrow it will rain or not, that's not a scientific theory. It is not falsifiable. And the same applies to the theory of Freud. This theory is as unscientific as tomorrow it will rain or not is. Why does he say that? Well, basically because Freud's theory by the Oedipus complex, it has a similar structure. It's A or not A. A, tomorrow it will rain, or not A. So A or not A, this formulation is a formulation that if you fill in the variables here, then you'll end up with a theory that's unfalsifiable, and according to Popper, that's unscientific. So if we look at Freud's theory of the Oedipus complex, he got that from Greek mythology. So Oedipus, before he was born, there was the prediction that he would kill his father and marry his mother. His father and mother being the king and queen. So when he was born, they got rid of him, but well, he was put on a road, and he was found, and he was raised in a neighboring kingdom by the king and the queen. And then at a later date, Oedipus heard, again, it was an oracle predicting that he would kill his father and marry his mother. And he didn't want to do that, not knowing that his parents were not his real biological parents. So he left the kingdom and, leaving the kingdom, he comes somewhere on a road, he gets into a quarrel with a man and he kills the man. Well, you might have guessed that was his dad, his real dad, his biological dad. And then he gets to that kingdom, and there is the Sphinx, and the Sphinx is terrorizing the kingdom, and the queen has put out an award for the person getting rid of the Sphinx. And to get rid of the Sphinx, you have to answer a riddle, and the riddle the Sphinx gives to Oedipus is: what walks on 4 legs in the morning, on 2 in the afternoon, and on 3 in the evening? And Oedipus says, well, that's a human being, because as a baby you crawl on your 4 legs, in the afternoon you walk on your 2 actual legs, and in the evening, when you're older, when you're elderly, you walk with a cane, so you walk on 3 legs. Well, okay, so Oedipus got rid of the Sphinx by answering the riddle correctly, and he gets to marry, that's the award, he gets to marry the queen, his mother. So the oracle made a prediction, and the prediction was successful. And from this, Freud gets the idea that all boys have an Oedipus complex. They want to kill their father and sleep with their mother. So then, that's a falsifiable claim. You can say, okay, we can test this. We can do research. We just ask little boys, do you want to sleep with your mother? Do you want to kill your father? And if they say no, then the prediction, then the hypothesis is falsified. And then we no longer use it, of course. If you know that the theory is false, and science is the method to justify the true beliefs, science is the method to gain knowledge. The moment you have found out that one of your beliefs is false, it's no longer knowledge. So Freud, when he did his research and he finds just one boy that says, "No, I don't want to sleep with my mother," then the theory is falsified. Just like finding one swan that's not white is enough to falsify the general claim that all swans are white. And then, well, then you put your big book on the Oedipus complex in the library, not there where the scientific books are, but you put it in the history of science department. It's just history, just like the theory of Ptolemy that the Earth is in the center of the universe, the theory of Copernicus that the sun is in the earth of the universe. We no longer teach that in astronomy class because we believe that it's false. So what did Freud do? Well, he says, well, my prediction is not that bad because I predict that a boy will say no or yes. Because if they say no, they are just in denial. They still want to kill their mother. They still want to sleep with their mother. They want to kill the father and sleep with the mother, but they just are in denial. Yeah. So basically what you're saying, boys have an Oedipus complex, and if you're going to test this, they will behave in a way that they want to kill the father and sleep with the mother or not. Well, yeah, it's just like saying it's going to rain or not. You're always right. Conclusion number 1. The theory of Freud can explain all cases. Every type of behavior is coherent with his theory. Yes, of course I predicted that the boy said no. He is in denial. Of course I predicted that he said yes. All boys want to sleep with their mother. So the conclusion, the second conclusion, is that the theory was formulated from the start in such a way that it could not be refuted, that it could not be falsified. It was unfalsifiable. It's what Popper calls immune for falsification. Just like you can be immune for a disease, a theory can be immune for falsification. And that's a bad thing. That makes it unscientific. A second example, that of Marx's theory of history, is a little different, but boils down to the same thing in the end. So initially Marx's theory was falsifiable, and thus scientific, according to Popper, because what did Marx say? He says, well, if there's a revolution, if there is the socialist revolution, from capitalism to socialism, that goes in different phases. The first phase being that the means of production change. The second one is that the social conditions change. Sometime later, the political power changes, and then the last change is that the ideological beliefs change. That's the history. That is what will happen. That is what will happen if there is a socialist revolution. And then we had the Russian Revolution. We had an actual socialist revolution. And what happened? The political power changed first. Not as the third phase, but it was the first phase. Okay, so that means that Marx was wrong. And just like with the theory of Ptolemy and Copernicus, the books then go from science to history of science. We no longer use them to predict future, in this case, social revolutions. So, well, clearly we were wrong. But people don't like that, right? So you don't like your theory going from actual science that you use to make predictions about the world to the history of science. Too bad, we were wrong. So we don't like that. So what happened is that you could give an ad hoc reinterpretation of the theory. That is, you add something for this event, ad hoc, in this case, that makes sure that what you have observed, in this case the Russian Revolution, where the political power changed first, no longer is a falsification of your theory. So basically what is said, well, the different phases could go in different orders. But then you say, well, these different phases describe things that change in a revolution, and now you're just saying, if there's a revolution, these things change. Well, that's the definition of a revolution, or what a revolution is, and then you basically says, when there is a revolution, there's a revolution. Yeah, sure. And if not, there is not. So the theory is now being made after the fact, made immune, and that again makes it unscientific, according to Popper. So, because Popper says the criterion of falsifiability is a solution to this problem of the demarcation. For it says that a statement or a system of statements, so that's a theory, in order to be ranked scientific, in order to be called scientific, must be capable of conflicting with possible or conceivable observations. So that's this idea, right? So you have a theory or a statement. It's scientific. When is it scientific? If it's possible to conflict with an observation. So you know what you should observe to say, I no longer believe my theory, my statement. So if you believe that all swans are white, then one swan that's not white is an observation. If you observe a black swan, then an observation conflicts with your statement, and then you give up your statement. All swans apparently are not white. Not all swans are white. There are black swans. You don't need to find the black swan. It is about falsifiability. It is the possibility, or even maybe just the conceivability, because you might not ever find a black swan, or in the case of all human beings being mortal, you just need to find one human being that's not mortal to falsify that claim. But you might never find that person. So it's conceivable, not actually possible, maybe. Maybe it isn't possible there is an immortal human being, right? So then it's just conceivable. But if it's conceived, the conceivable observation is a human being that's not mortal. Okay. So a statement has to be able to clash with an observation. Then it's falsifiable, and therefore it is scientific. In our alternative to tutorials, we'll discuss this again and apply it also to examples also from psychology. Popper turns to Newton and Einstein to explain that they were proper scientists, even though Newton was wrong. He reads this in 1919 in the Times. So he's from 1902, right? So that was when he was born. So this is again as a teenager. He reads in the newspaper, "Revolution in science, new theory of the universe, Newtonian ideas overthrown." Newtonian ideas are falsified. And this is at the time he is thinking about science and pseudoscience, and now it turns out that one of the great scientists that ever lived, Newton, was wrong. Again, you'll see that truth is not the hallmark of science. Newton had to think that what he said was true, and many people for a long time believed that he made true statements about the world. But it turned out that not all his ideas all his claims, all his theories were correct. Still, it's science. But now, they were scientific claims, but now, of course, many of his ideas are no longer in the library where it says science, it is history of science. So, what was going on? What was the newspaper article about? It was about an experiment done by Eddington, a big fan of Einstein, and for simplicity, we'll look at it in this way. Newton made a claim, or at least that's a claim that follows from his theory, that light goes always in a straight line. Actually, it bends a little when it curves around a heavy object like the sun, but for the moment it's way less than the curvation of light when it goes past a heavy object as predicted by Einstein. So let's say for simplicity's sake, light goes in a straight line according to Newton, and the claim of Einstein is that it curves, that it bends when it passes a heavy object like the sun. And Eddington did do the experiment. So he was looking at light of a star, what happens when it passes the sun, because the object has to be that big. So what you do is you want to compare two pictures. One picture you take at night of the stars, and then you need to put a really heavy object in between Earth and one of the stars, and then see whether when the light passes, whether the light passes the sun in this case, bends or not. Problem, of course, is that the sun also provides us with light and lots of it. So you then take a picture during the daytime when the sun is between the Earth and the star. So we're looking at the middle star here. And it now seems to be hidden behind the sun. The problem, of course, is, well, you're not going to see stars anyway when there is a sun, unless the moon blocks the light of the sun when there is a solar eclipse. Then you can see the stars again. Okay, so then you take a picture and then you'll see, are all the stars in the same position or not? So if light does not bend, or only very little, then the star behind the sun will, well, disappear. You will not see the star because the light passing the sun also passes Earth. But if it bends as much as Einstein predicted, then it also goes past the moon, so it bends around the sun, it goes past the moon, and so the moon is not heavy enough to bend light, so it gets to Earth. And then, from our perspective, it looks like the star is in a different place, because we're used to light going in a straight line, and then we see it as if it's moved. So if you then compare the two pictures, then you see this one star in a different place from in comparison to the previous picture. It looks like the star has moved. So in 1919, Eddington knew there was going to be a solar eclipse, and he wanted to test Einstein's hypothesis. He wanted to find evidence in favor of it. So what do you do? So we're concerned with the star on the left. This is not one of his pictures, but one I found on the internet that was free of copyright. What you do is you take a picture of the night sky, and then you know that if the sun is between that left star and Earth, then a body with an enormous mass, like the sun, in between the Earth and the star. That's what you need, but due to the sunlight, it's impossible to establish whether or not the star seems to have moved because, well, the sun is too bright. So you make a picture when there is a solar eclipse. So you do something like that. There is the moon, behind the moon is the sun, and then what do you see? Well, the stars behind the sun and behind the moon. The light goes in a straight line, it doesn't reach Earth, and if Einstein was wrong, then you would basically see the same stars in the sky, nothing has moved. But if Newton was wrong, and light does bend, then the star seems to have moved. And that is what Eddington found. Well, again, we have to put a footnote to this. Eddington had a team make pictures on one location on Earth and led a team doing that on another place, and he threw out the data that did not confirm Eddington's theory. Later, though, we have many scientists have actually done the proper research, and it turned out that Newton was wrong and Einstein's theory was supported. So the idea is that Newton's theory is wrong and Einstein's ideas were corroborated. Well, back then, in 1919, you could say, well, the evidence was not all that convincing. Still, it was in the times. Revolution in science, new theory of the universe, so the theory of Einstein, Newtonian ideas are overthrown. Newton's ideas go from science to history of science in the library. What is the new thing? So this is the example Popper gives. So that's why, well, most philosophers of science discuss that in a course in philosophy of science. Because, well, obviously, if you go in and talk to people in the street, if you ask them, if you do a survey in the Heuvelstraat here in Tilburg, and you ask people mention or name a scientist, many people will mention Einstein, many people will mention Newton without even knowing anything about them. So about their theories. So the impressive thing here of these two great scientists that actually are scientists according to Popper is the risk involved in a prediction. So what does science do? Science makes predictions about the next individual based on a general claim. We saw that in logical positivism. You have this deductive nomological model, you have a general claim, and you make a prediction with respect to the next individual the law applies to. All swans are white, you use that to make a prediction about the next swan. We saw that in Watson's theory on Watson's defense of behaviorism. What is the goal of scientific psychology? The prediction and control of behavior. You want to predict behavior. You need general laws to do that. In this case, it's about the prediction of the bending or not, depending on the theory, of light. Newton and Einstein both took risk. Watson, if he predicts the behavior of little Albert in this famous experiment and predicts that after he made the connection between a fluffy white animal and a loud noise, he will start to cry when confronted with a fluffy animal without the noise. That's a prediction, and that is risky. You might be wrong. If observation shows that the predicted effect is definitely absent, then the theory is simply refuted, it's falsified. You run the risk of being wrong. So if you're a weatherman predicting that tomorrow it's going to rain, you run the risk of being wrong. And that is impressive. That is what scientists should do. The theory is incompatible with certain possible results of observation. The theory, the prediction, can be falsified. Tomorrow it's going to rain. If it doesn't rain, the prediction was falsified and then something was wrong with the theory, the method, maybe. In this case, the impressive thing of Newton was that it predicted things with respect to seeing the star that Einstein did not predict, and vice versa. And well, you run the risk that it's wrong, and Newton was wrong. So Einstein also made a risky prediction, but he was spot on. That is, his theory is corroborated. So Popper says Newton's theory was falsified, it was refuted. Turns out that it's incorrect, it's false. But that doesn't mean that you can claim that Einstein was right, that is, that his theory is true. You only have this one instance that confirms his theory. If you do this, the experiment properly, the intention is not the intention Eddington had, that is, to find evidence in favor of Einstein's theory. The intention always has to be, according to Popper, is that you want to falsify your hypothesis. So you have a hypothesis that makes a prediction, and what you ought to do is to try and falsify it. And if then you find positive evidence for your theory, so if Eddington had done the experiment properly, he would have said, well, I'm going to do these experiments to show both hypotheses wrong, for instance, or show the theory of Einstein wrong. And then if you find positive evidence in favor of the theory of Einstein, then you say, well, I have corroborating evidence. It's not proof. It's just, well, positive support for the theory coming from a failed attempt to falsification. You try to falsify the hypothesis and you failed at that. And that means you have positive evidence, or as Popper calls it, corroborating evidence. Okay, falsifiability then is the demarcation criterion. Freud's theory was unfalsifiable, and therefore Popper says it's unscientific. And well, that of course is one of the reasons why you don't get Freudian theory as courses. They say, well, you should use that. It's part of the history of psychology course. Freud is in a department in a part of the library that's about history. It's not about contemporary psychological science, because we found out that, well, it lacks at least this demarcation criterion. It doesn't satisfy this demarcation criterion. It's unfalsifiable, or at least many claims. This, of course, is well, it's key to Freud's theory, and that's of course why Popper took it out and showed that, well, it's unfalsifiable and therefore unscientific. So is contemporary psychology scientific? Well, let me ask you. You're in your third year, you're probably thinking about writing your thesis, maybe you already started. So the question then is the hypothesis, your research question, is that a falsifiable hypothesis, a falsifiable question? I guess, and it could be wrong here, but I guess that this is indeed the case. If not, go talk to your supervisor, but because then really something is wrong. But I think your supervisor, when you proposed to do a research on something, you came up with a falsifiable hypothesis. Look at examples, the examples from previous lectures. EMDR is an effective therapy for PTSD, so that's a general claim. If someone has PTSD, you can use EMDR, it will be effective. Well, that is falsifiable. You just have to find one person with a post-traumatic stress disorder for which this therapy doesn't work. In economical psychology, loss feels stronger than gain. You just have to find one person that says, no, my gain feels stronger than my loss. That's enough to falsify it. And also you can find falsification in principle, right? So it is the possibility of falsifying your claim. An autism spectrum disorder is caused by a genetic deficiency. Well, if there is this specific genetic deficiency that results in an autism spectrum disorder, someone has it and does not have this autism spectrum disorder, you might say that's a falsification. Or when someone does not have this genetic deficiency but still has this autism, has an autism spectrum disorder, would also falsify the claim. So these claims are scientific. It looks like when you use falsifiability as a demarcation criterion, that indeed psychology is a science. So that means that you should know what to observe in order to reject the different hypotheses of psychology. And I just gave you some examples and what would refute them, what would falsify them. So yes, according to this demarcation criterion, psychology is a science. So that's good. Contemporary psychology can be classified as scientific when you use the demarcation criterion of falsifiability. And since, so I say contemporary psychology, because psychoanalysis, Freudian psychoanalysis, no longer is regarded as scientific. I have good reason not to regard it as scientific because, well, at least this core part of the theory, is Oedipus complex, that's not falsifiable. That's an unfalsifiable theory. It's as scientific as tomorrow it will rain or not. That's also not a scientific claim, so it belongs at best to the history of psychology. Freudian psychoanalysis is part, I believe, if I'm informed correctly, only of your history of psychology course. And there it belongs, because you should be aware of that it existed, what, well, the main theory was, and you also should know why it's not a scientific theory and why it has no practical implications if you do a course in Freudian psychoanalysis. Now let's turn to one big reason to say that only falsifiable claims are scientific claims, so that unfalsifiable claims are not scientific. So let's look again at our minute theory. Tomorrow it will rain or it will not rain. Is that informative? Well, it clearly isn't. So if you're looking on an app to see whether it's going to rain or not, and the app tells you, well, it will rain or not, if the weatherman on the news tells you tomorrow it will rain or not. You say, well, that's not why I'm using this app or looking at the weather forecast. I want to go to the beach. And if it's raining tomorrow, it's going to rain, I'm not going to the beach. I make different plans. And then wherever I go, I will take my rain suit or my umbrella with me. So what you want is scientific claims to be informative. And let's go back a little bit and see what again are we doing? Well, okay, so we were concerned ever since Socrates and Plato, well, even before that, we were concerned with knowledge, with acquiring knowledge. If you acquire knowledge, that is synthetic, it's new. You might know a lot of things, but you're also interested in gaining new knowledge. In this case, if you look at the weather forecast, you want to gain new knowledge about the weather conditions that apply to your region tomorrow. You want new knowledge. It has to be synthetic. Tomorrow it will rain or it will not rain doesn't tell you anything new. Of course it's going to rain or not. Just like it's going to snow or not, or the sun is going to shine or not, or the earth will explode or not. Well, you know that already. So you don't watch the weather forecast to be told things you already know. So a prediction has to be to the point. And that is problematic. Because if a prediction is to the point, it says, well, it will rain in the southern part of the Netherlands, but not in the northern part, then if you're living in the northern part of the Netherlands, you can go to the beach. And in the southern part, well, it's better not to go because, well, you will not have a nice day. You still can go to the beach, but take your umbrella. You're not going for a swim. So a prediction has to be to the point. It's going to rain in your region from 2 to 4. That's even better. The more accurate, the more to the point a prediction is, the more information you have, but also the more risk the one making the prediction runs that it's false. So when you read a horoscope, there may be problems at work, and you're going to say, oh yeah, there may be problems at work. Yeah, clearly that's always the case. If you go to your work, then, well, there may be problems. If it says, well, there's going to be a problem at work, that would be more to the point, and that would be falsifiable. But horoscopes make many of these claims that basically have a structure. It's going to happen or not. It may be, it's the same structure as it may rain. It's the same structure as A or not A. And yet it boils down to that. There may be problems at work. Yeah, if you go to work, there always can be trouble. There may be problems. Yeah, sure. I already knew that. So if you read a horoscope and it says that, well, that doesn't provide you with any information at all. But it is true. It's unfalsifiable. It's not informative, and it's not scientific. So here you see that if science is the method that gains us knowledge, and knowledge, if you gain knowledge, then it has to be new, it has to be synthetic, then in order to be informative, to actually be new, not something you already knew because, well, it's always true that tomorrow it will rain or not. In order to be synthetic, it has to be to the point, it has to be able to be falsified. So I hope you see that falsifiability is that is, at least falsifiable claims are informative, and that's what we're after, because we want to use the scientific method to gain knowledge, and with our knowledge we want to do things. So At this university, we want to understand the world in order to improve it, to advance it. As a psychologist, you want to have theories about therapy that help people. You don't want theories about therapies that do not help people, or theories that are so vague you can't really apply them. So you want the best possible theories because you want to advance society. You want to help people with mental problems, for instance. So if that's your goal, you should be informed as best as possible. Then we use a scientific method, and we don't do psychoanalysis because that's basically, well, unscientific. Boys don't have an Oedipus complex. Oh, well, they're in denial. Okay, so that doesn't help. So in order to make proper predictions, you need to have knowledge. We have seen that, of course, that an important aspect of knowledge is that it has to be true. So if you know that it's false, no longer use it. If it's unfalsifiable, don't use it. Use only theories, accept only theories that are falsifiable, because those theories are the only ones that are actually informative. They actually tell you something about the world. They might be wrong, and at the moment you know that they are wrong, don't use them anymore. But if you have corroborating evidence, if attempts to falsify them have failed, you can still use them. Now we're getting to a difficult issue in science in general, because we now know it's fairly easy to make claims that are always true. You just add "or not" to a falsifiable claim, or you say it might be the case, which boils down to the same. So, for instance, if you use EMDR, you say, well, why does that work? Well, EMDR works, the explanation follows, because making eye movements requires capacity of the work memory, which makes retrieval of memories less efficient, resulting in having a faint memory, and then you store that again, and etc. Then you have less vivid memories. Still you have them, and they will be less associated with emotions and stuff like that. Or not. Okay, yeah, that's true. And then anything you'll find in the world is basically support of this claim. So it's not only about thinking you say things that are true, you also should be informative. And that means you are allowed, as a scientist, only to make falsifiable claims. And that's part of your character. You should not make claims that are immune for falsification. Then they are always true, but you're being unscientific, you're not being informative. So you honestly have to believe that they are true. And if someone then asks you, are you sure? Are you 100% sure? Then you have to admit, as a scientist, that you always run the risk of being wrong, and that you cannot say, I'm 100% sure. So you're never going to say, as a scientist, I have proof for my claims. You only have evidence, supporting evidence, corroborating evidence, as Popper would phrase it. So you always have to be careful, and you must never say that something has been proven, or claim that a therapy works for everyone. If you do that, you become a pseudoscientist, because you're no longer telling the truth. You basically know that you're no longer telling the truth, so you're a liar. And you shouldn't lie, because Science is in the business of finding out what we know about, well, trying to provide us with knowledge, and knowledge is justified in true belief. You want your beliefs to be true. You have to believe that they're true if you use them in a therapy, for instance. So to come back to that example I just gave, that's relevant to psychology. Be careful in what you claim, not only as a scientist in a scientific research paper, but also as a clinical psychologist to your clients. Don't say that EMDR works for everyone after one session, for instance. So here's an example of a therapist that did not do that, but found out that colleagues did. So there was a boy who was afraid of fainting at school, so he was afraid to faint in class during recess at PE, and it got worse and worse. And when she saw him, he already had some EMDR sessions, and his therapist had told him that EMDR works for everyone. And then, of course, when it didn't work for the boy, his problems got worse, because he basically concluded, was an 11-year-old boy, I believe, he concluded, I must be really crazy. There must be really something wrong with me, because this therapy doesn't work. So you have to be careful. And maybe the diagnosis was wrong, and maybe there should be something else done by previous therapists, or doesn't matter. You always should be careful and never make bold claims that it works for everyone, because general claims can be falsified by just one individual allegedly falling under the general rule, but falsifying it, just one black swan, just one purple swan, refutes the general claim that all swans are white. One boy with certain problems can refute the claim that EMDR works for everyone with those types of problems. Make sure you don't get people's hopes up too high. Then there are many cases where you can show that people did do that often, and that's a difficult problem, of course. Often science is really difficult, and popular science, or journalists writing about science, or journalists that have no clue what science is, writing about science, say things in the newspaper, in the news, science has proven that, scientists have proven that. That's never the case. When that's in the newspaper, scientists at best have supporting evidence for a theory or a claim or a hypothesis. They never have proven anything. So there is also this image of science that people that are not scientists themselves have, that's incorrect, and is being enforced, it's being stimulated by people in the media giving this false image of science, that science is proving things. Because if you make that claim, if you say, I've proven this and this and this, and then it turns out to be false, then support in society for using this scientific method will go away. People say, well, it's just science, it's just an opinion. No, it's not. It's a method to gain knowledge, that is, to gain a hypothesis about the world that might not be corroborated, but we try to find out what the world is like, and we never claim that we have proven anything. But it's still our best method. It's much better than gazing at the stars and saying, well, I think because the star is over there and that star is over there, that you are depressed because the stars are over there. That's, to put it in jargon, bullshit. So now we're going to the more counterintuitive parts, because now you can say, okay, I can understand why a claim has to be falsifiable in order to be informative, and science has to be informative, so scientific claims have to be falsifiable. But we just saw that if you then try to falsify a claim and you find positive evidence, if you find corroborating evidence, that just is evidence that tells you that you have failed at previous attempts to falsify the claim. Nothing more. It doesn't say that the claim is true. So what Popper calls corroboration cannot be seen as inductive evidence for a theory, because, well, yeah, then you use induction. And Popper says you shouldn't use induction. That's irrational. We try to have an inductive-free science. That's what he's trying to do. He's trying to get rid of induction. So what you do is, if you have a hypothesis that has been corroborated, at least it has not been falsified, then you assume, then you take it to be true as long as it's not falsified. As long as you were living a couple of centuries ago in Europe and you made predictions about swans, your prediction would be, well, the next one will be white, and your prediction was corroborated every time. You made a prediction and you went looking for the non-white swan. And then you say, well, I still think it's true. It might be false. I just need to see one purple swan, one yellow swan, and then I will say my general claim is wrong. And when do you learn something? You don't learn something when you see the next white swan. You learn something when you see the next one and it's green. Because then you say, oh, yeah, I made a mistake. And then you say, apparently that theory isn't true. And then you adjust your theory, come up with a new hypothesis. Popper calls this the negative way to the truth, not finding positive evidence. That's basically what the logical positivists did. They had a hypothesis and they said, well, we have to confirm or verify it. And Popper says, no, we have a hypothesis and we try to falsify it. And when we actually falsify it, then we have learned something. Then we have learned that this is not true. So it's a negative way to the truth. You get rid of theories that are false. And then in the end, of course, you hope to end up with a theory that will not be falsified, even though it has to be formulated in a way that it is always falsifiable. You know what you need to observe in order to refute, to reject your theory. And Popper says, well, this is pretty straightforward because we can learn from our mistakes. But we'll see in a moment that's not really the case, because well, that we can learn from our mistakes, that's pretty straightforward, but he also gives an explanation of why we think the way we think, and then we'll see that well, it's counterintuitive. It's already, I think, counterintuitive that you, as a proper scientist, you have to try to falsify your hypothesis. So Popper's way to the truth is a very roundabout way to the truth, because as long as you don't actually falsify a hypothesis, it is just that, a hypothesis. All claims in science are falsifiable, and since they have not yet been falsified, but could in principle be falsified, they always have this hypothetical character. That's an important conclusion here. Science has no proven claims. It only has evidence in support of claims. And since there is no proof, but only evidence, you still say, well, it might turn out to be false. So in some sense, all claims in science are hypotheses. Right. Okay, now, we have seen that Popper is interested in the same question the logical positivists were interested in, and for the same reason. Science is the method to gain knowledge, so then the question is, what is science? He then tries to find a demarcation criterion and comes with falsifiability. Well, so far we haven't discussed whether it is a proper demarcation criterion, but there are a lot of things in favor of it. So we just seen that. One thing that he really differs from the logical positivist is that the demarcation criterion, falsifiability, makes a distinction between science and pseudoscience, but it does not make a distinction between meaningful and meaningless sentences. So where the logical positivists say our demarcation criteria make a distinction between science and pseudoscience, or science and non-science, and that's the same distinction as between meaningful and meaningless sentences, Popper says, I'm not interested in this issue about meaning or meaningless claims, and there can be lots of meaningful claims that are not scientific. So clearly falsifiability does not distinguish between meaningful and meaningless claims. He says unscientific claims might therefore be meaningful, like mythology, like Freudian theory. The claims made by Freud, the sentences, they are meaningful, but they are unscientific, according to Popper. He also has a different example. So he says the theory of evolution started as a myth. There is already in ancient times the theory of empirical, as he says, well, in previous times there was, when there were no human beings, there were attempts to make creatures from, say, 2 arms and a leg. That didn't work. A head and an arm, that didn't work. Now you need all the body parts we have now, and that works. So there's a kind of selection process that was going on, and then of course that was mythology, and we now have a theory of evolution by natural selection, and there was already a kind of a selection idea way back when. So from mythology, which is meaningful but not scientific, we can get claims that are falsifiable and therefore are scientific. The same goes with the theory of Freud. We have these ideas of the unconscious, events or processes, and these days we have things like priming and research into unconscious processing of information. Those are proper scientific hypotheses, and you could argue that they come in some sense from pseudoscientific but meaningful theories like those of Sigmund Freud. So just to be sure, Popper is not interested in this entire debate about meaning and meaningless claims. He's just interested in science. Right. Popper is a rationalist, and rationalists believe in the theory of nativism, the theory that are inborn or innate ideas. So that is the associated claim of rationalism. We also saw in an earlier lecture that Locke argued against innate ideas. He argued against Descartes and the Cartesians. He argued that it isn't true that the ideas postulated by the Cartesians, like the idea that what is an innate idea. And already Descartes, of course, rejected the Platonic view that all knowledge was innate. So in Cartesian philosophy, there are innate ideas, but way less than in Platonic epistemology. So Descartes was already less radical, and Locke basically shows, well, that what is you don't find it in all human beings, and even so, then it's not an inborn idea. So what's Popper's view here? Because clearly he will not believe Plato, and also Descartes would still be too radical, would still make claims that are not acceptable anymore. Popper is very clear. The theory of inborn ideas is absurd. So actual knowledge about something, like knowledge that Plato assumes we all are born with, like what a chair is, or what Descartes and the Cartesians assumed that we were born with, like the concept of God, or that what is, or all kinds of moral principles, that idea is absurd. But every organism has inborn reactions or responses, and among them, responses adapted to impeding events. So we have expectations, but they are not conscious expectations. We just behave in such a way that's clear that we have expectations about the world. So you have these animals that can walk immediately after birth. So if that's the case, it might be really convenient, like an antelope or something like that. So if you're born on the savannah, where there are always predators around, it's very, very convenient if you can immediately walk after birth, because you have to be able to run away for the lion, for instance. And then you don't need to check whether you can walk on the ground. That is an expectation an antelope has. You don't need to check whether you can walk through a tree. So if there's a tree on the savannah, there are sometimes, then you don't run away from the line, walk into the tree to see whether you can go from that. Now, you have the expectation that if you can't see through it, you can't walk through it. That's an expectation. I don't think the antelope has this explicitly formulated expectation. If I can't see through that object, then I can't walk through it. No, it just walks around it. Doesn't even try. So newlyborns are they also expect to be fed and protected, and basically, if you yourself probably also don't have all your expectations explicitly in your head. If you see a chair, you see what you can do with it. And of course I can ask you, what can you do with a chair? You can say, well, I can sit on it, I can put my bag on it, things like that. So you immediately see what it affords you to do. So so Gibson would call that affordances. You immediately see what you can do with a chair, or you can't do with it. You can walk on the floor or on the grounds of the savannah, and you cannot walk through a tree, but you can scratch your back using the tree if you have, being an antelope, all kinds of insects in your fur. Those are expectations. Those are things you immediately see what you can do with objects or things in the world. Basically, Popper is talking about instinct, you could say. So we are born with expectations, with knowledge. So it's not knowledge in the sense of ideas, in the sense that you are born with the idea of God, or the idea of that what is, or the idea of a chair. They are prior to observational experience. So you don't need to have seen a tree and see someone bump into it in order for an antelope not to think, well, maybe I can walk through it, not to try walking through it. And one of the most important of these expectations is the expectation of finding a regularity. So this goes back to Bacon. We see regularity even if there is no regularity. You run the risk that there is no regularity. Basically, what Popper says is,
we are induction machines. And that brings us to critical rationalism. Because this expectation to see regularity, even if there is no regularity, leads to dogmatic thinking. We are dogmatic thinkers by nature. You can give all kinds of examples. Take, you probably heard it in some of your lectures, taste aversion. So you eat something and then you get sick. You drink something and then you fall ill. And then the connection is made immediately, okay, if I eat that or if I drink that, I will get ill next time. So you don't do that. You immediately develop taste aversion. And there are examples with rats, for instance. So you can have a rat of which you know that it has never eaten a certain type of food because you raised the rat in a lab. So you've given the rat types of food you are aware of, and then you can give the rat some new type of food. Rats eat almost anything, so you can provide the rat with new food, and then proper food, nothing wrong with it. The rat eats it, and while the rat eats it, you use radiation on the rat, and the rat will get sick from the radiation. Well, question: what does the rat do when you 1 day later present the rat with the same food it ate when you used radiation on the rat? Well, it doesn't eat that food. It will not eat it. It has developed taste aversion, and it works, right? So better safe than sorry. It's a better safe than sorry mechanism. If you got ill from some type of food and there is other food available, then why eat that food? Better not run risk. So we are dogmatic thinkers by nature, because that is induction based on just one event, and is one, not what David Hume said. You have to observe the constant conjunction of two events, and then you use induction to say, well, it might be always the case. You have to see 100 billion balls collide and then the next rolling away, and then after a while you say, well, maybe I think that's always the case. No, it's just once that's enough. One time, event A preceding event B in the right order, at the right location. Then you infer, and we infer, human beings, but also other animals, rats, just give an example, infer that it will always be the case. We are causal thinkers by nature, induction machines. We are inductive thinkers by nature, and that makes us dogmatic thinkers. Because you can understand the rat being a dogmatic thinker. Why would the rat say, well, maybe I'm wrong, let's eat that food anyway and see whether I can falsify my hypothesis? That would be stupid from the evolutionary point of view, because then, well, if you were ill from eating that food, then chances are you indeed will get sick again and maybe even die. So why run the risk? Because it all boils down to reproduction in evolution by natural selection, and then you severely reduce your chances to reproduce, or of your genes being reproduced. So we are dogmatic thinkers by nature. So in many cases we might see irregularity while it's not actually there. In the case of taste aversion, for instance, when you eat something and you did not get sick from that food, but well, because there was a virus in the air. Still, you will not eat that food, at least for a very long time. So we need to be careful. Do not accept statements without critical reflection. Being critical is seeing if a theory or statement can be falsified. So that's something you ought to do. You, as a scientist, you say, well, I'm making this claim. Is that true? Can't it be falsified? So Popper basically explains why we have confirmation bias. So the tendency to interpret new information so that it becomes compatible with our existing theories, beliefs, and convictions. But as a scientist, you should not do what the logical positivist said. You should do, according to Popper, you should look for falsification, for the actual falsification. And if you're not successful in falsifying your theory, you're allowed to think that it's true, present it as if it's true, but always with the footnote that you might be wrong. So if you do research, you should looking for the falsification of your hypothesis. What would falsify it? And then look actively for it. Not just saying that would falsify it. Let's not go there. You have to go there. And if you do an intake with a client, for instance, so if you're no longer in the business of finding things out, but using information, then please don't just do the test. So if a doctor, a GP, sends a client to you, and the GP says, well, I think this person has a post-traumatic stress disorder or has an autism spectrum disorder, whatever. Don't just do the test that would confirm that. Also look at what would falsify it. So what happens in an intake, it might be that you say that you skip all the tests that would not confirm but falsify it. Do more testing than just the one that confirms it, or of which the results might confirm it. So what can you do? At the moment you have a falsifiable theory that you try to falsify, but you fail at doing so. Well, you can accept the statement. Is that irrational? No, because you use deduction and not induction. So if you came up with the theory that all swans are white, and Popper says you don't use induction, it's just a guess. It comes from somewhere. All swans are white. What you need to do is to look for a black swan. And then, if you find the black swan, then you use deduction to falsify your general claim. You say all A's are B, this is an A, my prediction is it will be B, and then you see an A that's not B. Well, then clearly not all A's are B. Not all swans are white if you see a black swan. That means that your general claim is false. And then you have falsified your claim. I will use different examples in one of the knowledge clips that is part of the alternative to the tutorials. Theories thus always are hypothetical, or a set of hypotheses. So even when you have a large amount of empirical evidence, you'll never have used EMDR for all clients with PTSD, for instance. So you can't make claims that it works for everyone. And it also might be the case that it works for no one, at least not for the reasons you might think it works. There might be a better therapy that actually works for the reason that's mentioned in the theory. So it might just be a coincidence that it worked. Maybe it works. So if it works because of well, some things in your brain other than filling the working memory. that is a different mechanism. That still, you might say, well, it works, but for different reasons. So you should always be careful. You should always be open to falsification of your theory, but not just hypothetical falsification, right? So there are many people who say, well, but it might be the case that, without any evidence. Well, we will return to that when we talk about interlocutors. We already saw that Popper, in some sense, accepts nativism. So that's part of what rationalism accepts in general. And science is rational, according to Popper, because it's rational to try to falsify your statements, because then you use deduction. So critical means trying to falsify your statements, your hypothesis, and then you are being rational because you use deduction in your falsification or your attempt to falsify your hypothesis, theory, statement, because deduction is a logically valid way of reasoning. So if science does do this, you get rid of induction, you use deduction, and then this indeed then supports the claim that science is rational, that it's a rational method to come up with knowledge about the world.
It looks like Popper did better than the empiricist, but Popper's view is not without problems.
The first problem is that pseudoscientific theories also make falsifiable claims, or at least make some falsifiable claims. Take, for example, astrology. There's this famous example where there are a bunch of skeptics, and skeptics here meaning people that doubt whether the paranormal exists and that argue against astrology and stuff like that. So not the skeptics we are talking about when we're talking about Socrates or Michel de Montaigne. They used some information of a person to give to 5 astrologers. So the idea is that astrology makes the claim that if you have the birthplace, the birth date, and the time of a certain person, they can tell you the personality of the person. So what did they claim about his personality? What did they claim about this person? Well, they made a lot of claims, but to stand out, this person is a good role model, and this person is very good with children. And of course, you know what this means. This means a good role model. You say, well, that's something, you know what has to be the case, what you have to observe or find out to falsify it, to refute that. Well, someone that's a criminal, for instance. A criminal is not a good role model. This person is very good with children. Well, someone that hits children, for instance, would not be a very good teacher. Kindergarten teacher, so if you have a criminal that hits children, then these predictions are falsified. And indeed, of course, you know where this is going. It turned out that these data about the birthplace, location, time, and date were of John Wayne Gacy, and he was a serial killer who actually killed a lot of boys, and he performed as Pogo the Clown, so he had some skills with children, but clearly he isn't good with children in a way that we usually use that phrase. So he got the death penalty in 1994. But at least the claims by the astrologers were falsified, and thus, prior to actually being falsified, they belong to science, according to falsifiability as demarcation criterion. So many claims made by astrologers are falsifiable and therefore they are scientific. But you want to get rid of things like this, or at least we want to explain why you don't have astrology for psychologists. Because if astrology really tells you something about the personality of people, then you should get astrology at least in your classes on personality. You don't get that. Why is that? And you can say, well, they make falsifiable claims. So according to Popper's demarcation criterion, it is science. And therefore it should be taught at university. But it isn't. So we will need to take a look at that again in a later lecture. Another problem with Popper's critical rationalism is that he tries to get rid of induction, but he fails to do so. That is, if you use deductive reasoning and then go and try to falsify your general claim. So you have all A's are B, then you predict that the next A will be B, and then you go look for an A that's not B. So you say all swans are white. What does that predict about the next one? Well, it also has to be white. So that's your prediction. And when do you falsify your general claim? When you find an A that's not B, when you find a swan that's not white, but say black. How do you establish that this animal here, so you come in Australia and there we have black swans, and then you say, oh, here I see a black swan. So apparently not all swans are white. How do you establish that this swan here, or this animal here, is a swan? Well, you use a concept, a general concept. But then you use induction, because you say all animals that have this shape and beaks like this and wings like this and necks like this and lay eggs and, well, all these properties, those animals are swans. But how do you know? Well, we arrive at by using induction. So go back to the very first lecture on Aristotle. He was thinking about general concepts. And then we turned to a general claim because it's easier to explain it with a general claim. But a general claim or a general concept is still general. And how do you arrive at a concept that applies to all individuals? How do you arrive at the concept of chair that applies to all chairs? Well, Plato says, well, I recall this from the world of ideas, the world of forms. And Aristotle said, no, I see all these chairs, and then I use induction to get to this general concept of what a chair in general is, and then I can apply it to the next individual chairs. The same here. How do I know that this animal is a swan? Well, I've seen a lot of swans, and using induction, it generated that concept of what a swan is, and now apply that to this animal, and then say, well, this animal is a swan and it's black, and therefore not all swans are white, but I use this concept to identify this animal as a swan, which I arrived by using induction.
Basically, what we have to conclude is that neither empiricism nor rationalism has provided us with a good answer, a satisfying answer to the question, what distinguishes science from pseudoscience?
So Popper has failed as well. He has no proper demarcation criterion, even though it does work better, falsifiability does work better than verifiability or confirmability. Falsifiability at least makes a distinction between two categories, science and pseudoscience, or science and non-science, and in both categories there is something. But there are falsifiable claims that are, because they're falsifiable, in the set of scientific claims that don't belong there. Also, it uses induction in identifying this individual here as an A, as a human being, as a swan. So you cannot get rid of induction. So an inductive free, an anti-inductivist view of science is impossible. So we need to take that into account when thinking about science. Both logical positivism, both empiricism and rationalism, Popper, have failed in the most important job they had to do, and that was to try and find a demarcation criterion. Verifiability, too strong. Nothing is science. Confirmability is too weak, and falsifiability also, because things that are not scientific, claims that are not scientific, become part of science. And we don't want that, of course. We want to get rid of pseudoscience. We don't want to do astrology at the university because it's pseudoscience. But so far, at least part of astrology has become science according to confirmability. Then basically all of astrology becomes science. And if you use falsifiability, all the falsifiable claims become scientific. And so only the claims that are unfalsifiable, like problems might arise at work, belong to pseudoscience. So astrology is partially science and partially pseudoscience. So the question now is, should we not give up on the project? We failed in finding a demarcation criterion. Should we just not stop?
This is a historical overview. So now empiricism and rationalism had failed to provide an answer to the question, what distinguishes science from pseudoscience? We have to take a look at how philosophers responded to this failure.
We will look in next lecture at the philosophy of Thomas Kuhn, who responded to this failure by indeed giving up on the project. He said, I am no longer trying to find a demarcation criterion. Let's take a look at an exam question from previous years. Which of the following statements would you attribute to Popper? A. The confirmation of a hypothesis results in knowledge, while the falsification of a hypothesis results in knowledge, so that's incorrect. The refutation of hypothesis results in knowledge, well, refutation is just another word for falsification, so that is correct. C. Both the confirmation and the refutation of hypothesis result in knowledge, that's incorrect. D. Growth of knowledge is impossible. Well, Popper says, well, we have the negative way to truth, we have the negative way to gain knowledge, that is by refutation of a hypothesis. You know that that hypothesis is incorrect, and you hope that then you're one step closer to the truth. So B, that's the only correct answer.
That's it for lecture 5. Stay safe.